Dylan Bizhikiins Jennings talking to us about climate impacts on Ojibwe tribal nations. Just a little bit about our group, because I know that not everybody who is on the meeting tonight is part of WHPCA, but Wisconsin Health Professionals for Climate Action, or WHPCA. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit climate justice organization, and we're dedicated to equitable climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions. We stress that climate change is a health emergency and that climate solutions really are health solutions. And so tonight you're actually joining our Media Empowerment, Education, and Clinical Integration Committee meeting, which is typically scheduled the third Wednesday of every month at 7:30. And we're working harder to bring in outside voices, voices outside of WHPCA into our meetings so that we can continue to learn in addition to continuing to educate the public. So just a brief agenda. So we'll just do a quick etiquette check. So if you have your microphone turned on, I'll ask that unless you are presenting or have a question at the Q&A, that you please turn your microphone off. And we love seeing everybody's face, but if you do have distracting video, then it would be nice if you could turn your video off as well. I'll then go into a little bit of it's supposed to be WHPCA info, a little bit of shameless plugging for our organization. I'll then introduce Dylan and let him do his presentation. And then after that, we'll do a question and answer session, and then we'll adjourn for the evening. So the Wisconsin Health Professionals for Climate Action, I already introduced the organization, but if you are interested in joining, you can go to our website at wiclimatehealth.com/join. If you take off the join at the end, that is actually also just the website, which you can follow events, you can sign up for newsletters. There are a number of things that are on our website that may serve as resources that you may find useful. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then if you don't have the ability to donate your time, we certainly would welcome any kind of monetary donation if that's something that you're capable of doing. You can certainly go to our website, and in the upper right-hand corner, there is this donate link or donate button. And when you click on that, you could make a monetary donation if you're in a position to do so. Certainly not a requirement, but always welcome. So let's move on to tonight's speaker. So tonight we have Dylan Bizhikiins Jennings. He is a member of the Martin clan. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with degrees in anthropology, archaeology, environmental studies, and American Indian studies. Jennings is set to complete his master's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Nelson Institute in spring of 2021, so this year. Jennings is a Bad River tribal member and a former tribal council member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Ojibwe, where he served 2 consecutive terms as an elected official. He served as an appointed representative for the EPA Region 5 Tribal Operations Committee. Currently, Dylan resides in Odana and works as the Director of Public Information for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. This job requires him to be fluent and up to date with tribal news and issues. He also serves as a writer, photographer, and editor for Mazenaagan newspaper. Bizhikiins presents at many public engagements in schools throughout the Midwest on topics ranging from traditional subsistence, sovereignty, tribal environmental perspective, cultural immersion, Ojibwe, tribal historic preservation, food sovereignty, Ojibwe curriculum, and cultural identity. Bizhikiins is also an adjunct instructor at Northland College in the American Indian Studies Department, where he teaches Introduction to Ojibwe Language and Culture. And he also serves as an appointed member of the Wisconsin Governor's Task Force on Climate Change. And we can't thank him enough for his role on that task force and the recommendations that came out this past fall, really pushing forward kind of the agenda in Wisconsin. Bizhikiins has been a recent recipient of the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development 40 Under 40 Award, and a recipient of the UW-Madison Nelson Institute Rising Star Alumni Award. So without further ado, I will go ahead and hand over the screen sharing, so to speak, to Dylan.
Miigwech, thank you, Andrew. Anin Gakinawia. Nitsa Bizhikiins Indigenous Wabashashi and Doda Mushkazibing and Dunjba Miguchuenda Mechanical Gino Agape Jaigoma Sonongum Gaigo, Nimiguchuenama Odigyu, Ekina Manidu, Gaijigama, Gaigo, Bindash Gaiga, Gawenji Bimatazianama, Nimiguchu Tagus in Oasia, and Gaigo Benatia, Gaigo Giguyan, the Shuenama Odigyu, and Anishinaabe wa King. It was Yaganashi, Imaginates. So good evening, everybody. Every important part of my presentation I've just highlighted in our language, so I think that's pretty much a wrap. So we're pretty much good here tonight. Anasha, I'm just kidding. Just introduce myself in our language. Our language is, we were talking just before everyone started logging on. Our Ojibwe language is extremely beautiful and articulate. And so, I wish I'm still a lifelong learner of our language, and I wish someday we could get to a point where I could do these presentations in our language, right, and everybody could understand, because English isn't very beautiful, right? English is really hard and sometimes negative connotations and inflections to it, and so very much enjoy and practitioner of our language. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Introduction always makes me sound better than I am, right? Oh. So I'm Dylan. Very, very grateful and honored to be here tonight. As Andrew had noted, I have kind of a wide array of experience and background. I'm 29 years old, but I was fortunate and honored to be put in different positions over the years, especially in leadership positions at a very young age, and very humbled for that ability and for that honor to help with that. And I think that's shaped a lot of the initiatives and a lot of the endeavors that I've tried to undertake in my career so far. And as Andrew said, I come from Bad River. Importantly, I'm an Ojibwe man, and I'm a practitioner of our way of life, a learner of our language, but most importantly, I'm a dad. Luckily with these Zoom meetings, you can't tell that I have a dad bod, that it's nice that, we just have the top portion of things here. But a lot of this, what we're going to be talking about relates back to, what it means to me, to be a father in our communities, and what it means to provide and help our children and our future generations to live a good, healthy life, and what that means to us as Ojibwe communities. So we're going to be talking a lot about subsistence lifestyles and those specific impacts of climate extremes, climate variabilities, and climate change on Ojibwe lifestyles and Ojibwe subsistence practices. And so I'm actually going to share my screen now. And if you have questions, certainly you can put them in the chat, and I will try to acknowledge them. Also, if you don't want to put it in the chat, you can always save it till the very end, and we can go over that. So can everybody see this timeline okay?
Looks good.
All right, so this is a publication we actually just released a couple months ago. Timeline of Anishinaabe treaty rights in Northern Great Lakes. It highlights the history of our communities within this area. And I think it's really important to understand, our present situation that we've found ourselves in, obviously, but in order to develop, equitable approaches to some of the climate situations we're in, it's absolutely imperative that we understand our history and understand the past. And so we start with, our migration story. Ojibwe people come from the East Coast and travel to where we call the place where food grew on water. And that prophecy, we traveled from the East Coast, took us to what we know as, the modern day, present day Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Great Lakes region. And that's where we found manumin, wild rice, that food that grew on water. We followed that prophecy over, some say over the span of a couple hundred years. Some even say it was longer. And so we travel to these places and become some of the original inhabitants of this area. And in general, the way that we acknowledge ourselves is Anishinaabe, which literally means like original people, or the first people that were lowered to this place. Other people commonly know us as Ojibwe. I think linguistically, Oji refers to the puckering. So some people believe that it referred to our style of moccasins, the puckered toe moccasins, right? Referring to Ojibwe people. And then more commonly, and unfortunately, we're also known as Chippewa. And that's also a linguistic error, we believe, is, you know, a lot of the European contact that we'll get into began to distort and mispronounce a lot of our language, right? And so in the history books and even the way that the federal government recognizes us is as Chippewa, right? But, you know, if you think about it, Ojibwa and Chippewa are very similar in how they sound, and that there's no coincidence there. So when we look at this timeline map, you know, we start way over here on the left side, and what we believe is that within the context of how we understand the world and where we live, right? We don't have interaction with Europeans until about 1620s. That's when we see some of that first documentation through journals, diaries, and whatnot, especially in our neck of the woods here. But even prior to entering into treaties with the federal government or with the European nations that came here, you know, the first treaties that we believe we have are with everything in creation. So what I mean by that is we have agreements between every order of creation, and basically what that acknowledges is that as human beings, we're extremely pitiful, right? We're not, we don't see ourselves as, you know, above the environment in any way, or almost not even as at the same level, right? If anything, we'd be below, because we need everything to survive from the environment. The environment doesn't need us, I can assure you that. And when we talk about, you know, our way of life, that ideology is very, very prevalent. And so within our stories, originally we have agreements with the deer, with the fish, with everything in creation, all these different orders, in which those ones would stand up for us to help take care of us, to help subsist. And then, you know, we have that inherent responsibility to also reciprocate. And so it's a relationship of reciprocity right off the bat. Eventually we get into treaty signing, right? We start seeing like some of the first treaties signed in the late 1700s, Treaty of Greenville, Treaty of Prairie du Chien. Some of those initial treaties established boundaries, some established trade, partnership. And then we start getting into the land cession treaties, which are in the kind of like the early to mid 1800s. And that's when the United States begins to make agreements with the indigenous communities in our areas here, and on paper acknowledge, you know, acknowledge what their intentions are. And so the United States at that time, you know, wanted mineral rights, wanted land for expansion. We think of like Manifest Destiny and all the things that were going on in the early 1800s. And this time period really, you know, really represents two very contrasting worldviews, right? It's very important to understand that, right? One view focused on, you know, expansion and some exploitation of resources, and another worldview or life way focused on survival and perpetuation of their way of life. And so during this time, the United States wanted land, so these treaties were entered into, where the tribes then subsequently cede or sell millions and millions of acres of land to the United States in exchange for things like commodities, you know, equipment, some money. And in addition, one of the most important parts was usufructuary rights. And usufructuary rights we're going to come back to, but that's one of the very big parts, and some of the contention within these treaties are the rights to hunt, fish, and harvest on the land that's ceded. So you can see within this map here, right here on the bottom, is that these specific treaties, and then delineated by these colors, are the lands that get ceded. And here's the present day states, just to kind of give you a reference, right? We've got Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and these particular treaties cede these lands to the government, and in exchange, the tribes or the bands that signed that maintain that they stipulated they wanted the rights to hunt, fish, and harvest on these lands in time perpetuity. 1854 is also a unique treaty, which also establishes permanent homelands and reservation boundaries, but we'll get into that. So as we move forward within the timeline, we start to see federal Indian policies take shape within the United States. And starting in the southern part of the what we would call the United States, a lot of tribes are actually being forcibly removed from their homelands, their ancestral homelands. That's a big part of United States history that isn't talked about as much, right? Tribes are being forcibly removed and forced to, removed from places where they had, resided for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years, and living and adapting to these places and their climates and the resources there. And so, like I talk about us having those inherent relationships with everything in creation, that's very similar for tribes all over the place. So to be removed from that is it's a big deal. We also see during this time period a lot of assimilatory practices and policies, right? So everything from the Dawes Act to, in 1882, they passed basically passed a law that any tribal pagan ceremonies are outlawed. So a lot of communities are not allowed to practice their inherent way of life, their ceremonies, their spiritual practices and beliefs. And then a lot of assimilatory practices like the implementation of boarding schools, right? We see a lot of that all throughout the 1800s, attempting to transition these communities, these unique ways of life into mainstream society through things like agricultural practices and other sorts of mainstream practices. And so, this is a very, very difficult time for our tribal communities in this area. But still surviving, still moving forward. Another thing, after the signing of these treaties, and also during and around that time, that creates another layer of ambiguity and complexity is the notion of statehood. So you guys see that, 37, 48, and 58 are when Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota become states, all right? And that's a very important part too. Statehood complicates this relationship between the federal government and the Ojibwe tribal nations. It creates another layer of governance confusion and ambiguity where a lot of the states, begin to impose their own laws and regulations on the tribes and not acknowledging those federal treaties, those treaty rights that were negotiated with the federal government. And so that creates another area of hardship. I mentioned a part of these treaties sometimes were issued commodities and rations, which we'll come back to as well. That's a very big part of that. Oftentimes this period of time is really characterized by colonization, right? We'll talk about that a little bit, but exposure to that colonization eroded a lot of these communal abilities to provide for families and directly related to health, as we'll get to. And then a lot of these practices, from the signing of treaties to assimilatory practices to what happens next, eventually erode our traditional food systems and collapse our traditional diets. So what happens here, we start to see within this time period here, moving forward, we start to see late 1800s to mid 1900s, where states begin to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan begin to enforce their laws and regulations on tribes really heavily, starting in 1920. So you can see it's not that long since the tribes or the bands enter into these treaties. They get usufructory rights to harvest and to survive, to basically perpetuate their way of life. And then come, early 1900s, all of a sudden the states are not recognizing that. So this creates a really difficult time for our communities, a really dark period of time, as if that wasn't dark enough, right? Where a lot of tribal harvesters and people providing for their families are being arrested, thrown in jail, some even killed for doing nothing but harvesting for their families and trying to feed their families in that subsistence lifeway. And so we go through this period of time now where it's kind of just a very negative time period. And then a lot of tribes begin to say that's enough. And you see a really big uptick in uprising where a lot of nations and bands are pushing this through the judiciary system and contesting what the states are trying to do. And so you end up with some of these big landmark treaty cases, like in '54, the John Drew case is initiated in Michigan. Also in Michigan, the LeBlanc case. And then eventually some of these favorable rulings in favor of the tribes, where they finally acknowledge treaty rights are the supreme law of the land. United States entered into these agreements. You need to figure out ways to uphold them. And so eventually that's all like GLFWC and some of our other intertribal organizations get created. And it's important to note throughout all this, you might ask like, well, why is this significant? Well, harvesting and traditional subsistence is directly tied to our community's spirituality and to our what we refer to as Minobimatziwan, which is like our health, right? Our well-being overall. And so this is a very, very big part of that. And as we move forward, we see a lot of additional movement on the tribes on the part of tribes, right? And more major treaty cases that signify that revitalization is coming. So in 1978, finally, it's always crazy to me that this is a thing. 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act is passed, and so tribes in 1978 are technically finally allowed to participate in their way of life. So you can think of multiple generations impacted by that one act in the late 1800s. A lot of rippling effects, right? Also, tribes at this point are building a lot of capacity, doing a lot of things in the environmental realm, building up their tribal departments, and really doing a lot of really good work. So this is, like I said, this is available at our site with ogitchida.org. We just finished this. There's also a series of short videos that talk about a lot of these cases, and if you're interested in that, you should definitely check that out, pursue that a little bit further. Are there any questions about this so far that I've gone through? I wanted to make sure everyone has a really strong historical foundation. No.
I have a question. Do you have video content on your website for like middle school age children?
Yes, if you visit glyphwic.org, you should be able to see a resources tab, and those videos are appropriate for that age. We also have developed, in part with DPI, and Historical Society, some lesson plans that educators can utilize to go along with the videos that were created.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, great question. So when we start to get into those specific impacts on some of our communities, it's important to note that history is a very important part of it, right? Because as we get into talking about what does equity mean, right? We understand that not all of our communities start off on the same page, on the same level by no means, right? And so a lot of our communities have gone through a lot of trauma, a lot of colonization, and just a lot of negativity in a way on the part of the federal government, and in working with the states. And so to me, and that's not to make anybody feel sorry for our communities, but that's to note how resilient our communities really are, right? Living and continuing to grow through extreme adversity. A lot of people, part of this are probably health professionals and know some of these stats better than I do, but these are just some things that you can actively get in the Wisconsin Department of Health site. these are real stats. These are just a couple stats, right? If you really to dive deep into them, you could really dive into all of the disparities and the statistics that exist out there. But 65% of our tribal populations are overweight compared to the mainstream population. 20% have heart disease, and 20% heart disease and cancer are some of the leading causes of death in our tribal populations, right? So that's a big number as well. And diabetes, 3 times the amount of the general population. So these are modern day real life health statistics that our communities currently encounter, and they're directly related. We believe directly related to our history, right? When we talked about that change, that assimilatory process, and the erosion of our traditional diets, right, leading to some of these statistics over time. It's pretty overwhelming when you think about it. A lot of our traditional way of life, we're replaced by some of the more modern, or not necessarily modern, but some of the more artificial foods that people still eat, right? So when those commodities and those government issued rations that came as part of the treaties and as part of first contact, a lot of the foods and things that were given to our tribal nations were things like processed flour, sugars, other things, lard, things that were not traditionally a part of our diets, right? And so, it's no wonder our health disparities are that rough. So how do we recognize some of these climate impacts on subsistence harvesting? That's one of my munchkins. I always put my kids in my PowerPoints, but and so that was actually taken a couple days ago in our family sugar bush. This is that time of the year that we're doing some really, really awesome things in the environment. And so a note before that, when we talk about our communities and the knowledge we maintain, sometimes scholars will call the knowledge that we have traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. To us, it's just knowledge, right? It's a part of how we understand the environment that we have resided in for a long time. And it's also recognizing some of these biological indicators that tell us when it's time to harvest or it's time to do certain activities. And so that's one area that we'll kind of keep coming back to in relation to climate change and its effects. So like I said, it's sugar bush time of the year. My kids love sitting there, and my gosh, especially Sania there, she will sit there and just drink sap from the tree just like that for hours if she could. They love it that much. Bizhikiins is what we call it in our language, and that's our word for the process of making maple sugar or maple syrup, right? Our sugar bush. The traditional knowledge, or the knowledge that comes with that, as far as biological, ecological indicators, tells us that when we hear those first woodpeckers start pecking at the tree in the springtime, that's a natural indicator that it's time for sugar bush season, for Bizhikiins. And so many of you probably heard those pileated or those downy woodpeckers out there, the ones that are really loud on the trees, right? You don't hear them as much in the winter time, but you really start to hear them in the springtime, and that's one of those indicators we've used over time, right? That's something that one of my good friends, one of his grandmother used to always say, and so that's that knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation. What we're seeing is shorter and sporadic seasons, all right? So for those familiar with sugar bush and maple trees, tapping maple trees, the sap, in order for it to flow, requires specific conditions within the tree's pressure system, right? And the sap needs cool evenings and often, semi-warm days to flow well. I don't need to tell you guys all this, especially if you're living in Wisconsin. The last few weeks especially are great examples of extreme climate variation, right? Where we get, polar vortex, right? Then to some mild winter weather, then to 70-degree weather, then to some 75, 80-degree weather, and then back down to somewhat mild spring weather, right? And so that all plays a role in affecting our sugar bush season, right? And it affects the way that sap flows. You know, the temperature and climate change has also been proven and shows that it's, you know, it's affecting the growth of maple trees as well. We won't get into all that research, but you know, the temperature extremes will eventually continue and will eventually create non-ideal conditions for these trees to flow the way they need to flow. And we always say that, you know, our season finishes up as the maple trees begin to bud. And that's when the sap kind of starts turning, they say, and is no longer good for boiling for these purposes. So that's a very important part of our ceremonies as well. The saps in particular, and the you know, and the process itself signifies revitalization and renewal. So we often have ceremonies where we drink some of that sap, and that's what that symbolizes. Wigwasa Kawin, in our language, we call that like harvesting birch bark, right? Some of you might have seen, you know, a report a few years ago developed by Forest Service and Glyphlic and a few other partners that identified birch trees are showing a trend of receding northward. And tribal communities are seeing that in real time right now, where, you know, you can see on the right there, that's an image of a birch bark canoe that we made with an elder in our community, our relative Jingwe Benes. And we're having a really difficult time finding the size birch trees that are needed to do things like that, to perpetuate some of those teachings and traditions. They're becoming far and fewer and far in between, right? To be able to find them like that. If you see in that picture, also harvesting some birch bark, you need trees about that size, and that's not even a ginormous birch tree, right? That's a good size one. And so we're having a more difficult time finding those types of trees, and so that's concerning to a lot of our elders and to a lot of our cultural practitioners concerning those practices. Giguya Kawin, fish spawning and fishing season. So this is a big one too. Walleye, for example, very prized fish in the state and within the region, right? How many of you like to eat walleye or fish for walleye? A lot of you probably. It's a prime fish for consumption for our tribal communities as well. With increased water temperatures, increased things like water clarity or competition with non-native species or species that can adapt a little quicker and easier, walleye populations are having a difficult time throughout the ceded territory, right? We're seeing that you know, kind of outright overall decline in a way, and it's a concerning thing. This is an example of some of the TEK that kind of governs how we harvest, right? So fisheries biologists might tell you walleye spawn at approximately 42 to 50 degrees, and that temperature triggers the spawn. Our TEK says when we start to hear spring peepers, that's when the fish are ready to be harvested. That's when the fish are in the places that we've traditionally harvested. And you know, 9 times out of 10, I've always seen that practice and that teaching come through as true. And then those other fish there too are also affected in different ways. Up in our neck of the woods, you know, we harvest a lot of lake fish like trout, coho, from the big lake, and we're also seeing very, very similar things. And I think Glyphwick is actually undertaking a long-term study on dietary structure of some of the lake trout and whether we're seeing them, you know, kind of recede to you know, cooler, deeper water. So Glyphwick did develop a vulnerability index years ago, which identifies these species and just how vulnerable they truly are. We have a really awesome climate change division at Glyphwick that you know, is working on a lot of really amazing things. This is one example of that vulnerability index. Walleye are moderately to extremely vulnerable based upon many factors, from barriers, both natural and anthropogenic. And oops, this is another picture of those lakefish I was talking about. And it also climate increase also gets them out of their physiological thermal niche, which is very important for walleye. So this is actually a resource I can post in our group chat. You guys can have access to this. This is on our website as well. And so the point of that vulnerability index in general was to bring both the science and the traditional knowledge to the table and kind of advance, what some of the cultural and science priorities were for our tribal nations. Another thing that we see with fish populations is, increased pollution oftentimes adds to the bioaccumulation of mercury. And a lot of you are probably familiar with mercury. So walleye and fish populations bioaccumulate this stuff over the years. Our communities are heavier, large consumers of walleye within the ceded territory. I mean, you're talking multiple meals of the stuff every month. And so we recognized we had to, develop really precise and informative information about and publications about the mercury content in some of our lakes. And as you can see, some of the lakes that our harvesters have traditionally gone to for many, many generations and continue to harvest. Basically, the advisory is either do not eat ogawag or walleye from these lakes, or only eat up to one meal per month, right? So in a way, our some of our fish are the resources that we depend upon or subsist upon are diminishing over time, and so that's a very concerning way, either through recession, through climate change, or ancillary effects through mercury bioaccumulation within the lakes. So these resources are also available on our website too, and I can put that in the chat. So this is very, very important information that we try to get into every circle we can. I mean, walleye, people all over the state, all over the region enjoy walleye, and it's sad stuff, but it's important to know. All right, so Kawin, wild rice. Wild rice is a very important part of our way of life. Like mentioned, it's one of the reasons why we are where we are to this day. It's also a very important food staple. Also, just like our other foods, one of the most healthiest things you can put in your bodies, right? Manoomin, from our vulnerability index, is one of the most highly vulnerable resources that we've looked at to date. Really susceptible to high water levels, which we're seeing more and more of over the years, and also in general, flooding and extreme weather events create really detrimental conditions for manoomin growth, and so that's also a very big concern to our tribal communities, because wild rice, much like with all these other foods, are very much present in a lot of the ceremonies and a lot of the practices that we continue to do. Also a very big part of our way of life. And another important thing to note that, even though these foods are present in our ceremonies and, there's focus on that spiritual health, the physical health aspect also comes into play too. So it's not even just about putting good food in your body, right? The action of actually harvesting a lot of these foods is a lot of work, right? So, the physical labor and the work that goes into actually going out for, an hour and harvesting an hour's worth of wild rice, when you have it's almost like a 50% yield ratio. So you might harvest 10 pounds of green wild rice, but when you finish processing it, like we saw in the pictures there, you might end up with less than 5 pounds, right? And so the work you put in to all of these things, there's a lot of physical activity involved. Same with maple sugaring. You guys are all aware of that too, I'm sure. You know, it's a 40-to-1 ratio typically. 40 gallons of sap equals one gallon of maple syrup. And so I think a lot of our communities in general were very concerned about, you know, what climate change is doing to our subsistence systems in general. If we're going to take go back to the beginning and take maple sugar or maple syrup, for example, you know, as it becomes less and less available because those seasons are becoming shorter and shorter, we worry about that increasing the you know, the gap that exists for you know, impoverished or minority communities from obtaining those good healthy foods, because, you know, as demand goes up and as the availability goes down, you know, you're going to see a huge spike in price, you know, to get real maple syrup, real maple sugar. That's probably one of the most healthiest sugars you can put in your body. And so I think a lot of our communities are concerned about that, you know, about that's going to increase that economic gap, but it's also going to increase the health disparities as well, because what's your alternative to real maple syrup? It's the sugary, you know, Aunt Jemima, not very good for you, not even maple syrup stuff, right? It's basically like artificial sugar water. So I'm sorry if anybody works for any of those maple syrup companies. I don't mean to offend. Another important one is Mowin's Kawin, which is basically like berry harvesting, right? We're also seeing effects on our berry systems as well, from growth period to growth location to competition with non-native species that you know, never typically grew in those areas that a lot of these berries grow as well. That's my 4-year-old. She loves picking Jiguaguanage, which is like what we call those leeks or wild onions. And getting back to our knowledge systems, right? So oftentimes our knowledge systems are linked up with our harvesting practices. And so, you know, what a lot of our communities are also concerned about is just the notion of, you know, the timing and the rhythm of the environment being upset, right? Where, you know, some years we're often hearing those spring peepers, you know, going off, you know, well after or well before ice out, right? And so we're seeing, you know, kind of a gray area that you know, we've potentially never have seen before in our history of being here. This is just a map because I wanted to talk just briefly about you know, understanding colonization and its effects. Give you an example. Here's, you know, a map, 1830, you know, where tribal lands were all located, you know, all throughout the present day state. We talked about that assimilatory area and that transition era. The amount of land base greatly diminished. And then even further on now, all we have are these small tracts of land that our reservations are located on. And across the United States, you know, 500 plus federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes. And so each one of these communities, I can guarantee, is facing very similar disruptions in their subsistence lifestyles and in other ways being disproportionately affected. You know, a lot of that gets back to colonization, right? The formal and informal methods that maintain the subjugation or an exploitation of indigenous peoples, lands, and resources. That's one of the best definitions I've come across that describes what colonization is and colonialism. When we get into actually trying to address some of these things and understanding colonization and understanding some of its systemic effects, this is a really good I guess, diagram image of, you know, how we should understand things, or how I think, you know, it helps to understand things and where different and other communities are coming from, right? So you guys can see from the bottom, reality, right? Reality is that some people start off in, you know, underground, right? Some people start off built up on something, right? You know, equality might look like giving everybody that same platform, right? Equity might look like elevating the voices that are smaller, right? And social justice, just, you know, in our opinion, just get rid of the fence that exists there, right? Get rid of those proverbial barriers in general. Um, and a lot of communities are really focused these days on decolonizing, right? So addressing colonization and figuring out ways to get rid of that, right? So a big part is just being critically conscious that, you know, these things are going on, and um, you know, history, especially for our tribal nations, hasn't always been the best within the United States. Um, and so, you know, it compels us to rethink how we define and how we push forth with the notion of environmental justice and equity. All right. So that's I didn't want to make a huge, extremely long presentation. I really wanted to open it up for you know, questions and things that, you know, we could, in hopes that we could potentially have a short dialogue, and anything that we went over or clarify things, because I know, you know, some of the stuff gets pretty deep and heavy. So um, definitely definitely open to talking about some of this a little bit more.
Well, thank you so much, Dylan Miigwech. We will go ahead and move on to that Q&A. And for as far as how we want to do things for the Q&A, if people want to just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions, I think we have a small enough group that that'll work out great. If things start to get complicated, we can use the raise hand function. If it makes you feel better to use the raise hand function, you can go ahead and we'll be happy to call on you as well. But I think anyway, we can kind of spur more organic conversation would be great.
Go ahead, Dick.
Go ahead, Dick.
Oh, thank you. Dylan, thank you very much. I've been educated on areas that I know very little about. I'm curious, since we're a large group here that is interested in climate action, how are the tribal communities seeking to interact with others who are non-tribal communities, such as this group, and look at the climate things where they can have mutual interests and mutual values? I see all the things that are relevant to your lifestyle, etc. But those overlap to a lot of other people. Your point about the maple syrup. I've been hearing this from maple syrup people who buy and sell this and make a living from it, who are non-native, or, you know, indigenous populations, and they're worried because they're also seeing very poor maple syrup. That's an example. So that's the question: is how do you see an interaction so that's more collaborative? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. So I think oftentimes a lot of, you know, speaking as a former tribal leader that has had his hand in a lot of different things. Tribes are a lot of times taking the lead on environmental battles that your local cities, counties, and even sometimes the state governments can't take on. You know, tribes have been able to utilize their sovereignty and their treaty rights, you know, as leverage to win some really phenomenal court cases, and also to you know, to kind of levy that sovereignty in a way to help protect the environment, right? And so, you know, a lot of times, you know, I don't know that tribes everywhere have the time that to reach out to local communities as much as, you know, they probably wish they could. But I know from experience that when people, you know, fellow allies reached out and are like, you know, hey, we want to do something, we want to help. And you have to remember too, every tribe is completely different, experiencing different battles and struggles, right? But you know, oftentimes if we reach out, there are points within the communities that are really receptive to try and figure it out, you know, common ground, and figuring out ways that you know, ways that the public and other communities can help. And I mean, I take this as an example. You know, Bad River has fought a lot of environmental battles. Over the years, there was a few years back, there was a proposed mine. I don't know if you guys remember the GTAC mine. That would have been one of the largest open pit taconite mines within the country, and some say even within the world. That would have been right the headwaters of our Bad River. We were continually told that there would be no environmental effects, even though it was at the headwaters of our river. And we were told a lot of things, right? And the community refused to accept that. And in partnership with the local community and the local counties, and just a wide array of community activism from downstate and all around the area, fought it off successfully. For the time being, we still think that it could be a threat in the future, but there's things like that you can actively partner with. When like I said before, tribes are really looking to preserve things for future generations. That seventh generation mentality philosophy is what guides a lot of decision making. So oftentimes we're forced to think about our children's 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 children, right? Even on down, because that's our lands are permanent here, right? Our lands are established through treaty, so we're not going anywhere. So if we make this place, bad for our future generations to live, we're not doing our community justice. And so when we make those decisions to fight off what we perceive as environmental threats that are going to only continue to the perpetuation of fossil fuels and extractive industry and pollution, those are things that I think your average community members and local communities can jump onto and participate in. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. And when you mention the sort of 7 generations, that makes me feel anxiety, right? Because it's so hard for me to imagine what things are going to look like, 2 generations, let alone 7 generations from now. So how do you balance that in many ways positive outlook and like really beautiful outlook with potential stress or anxiety that it may or may not bring?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always go back to one of my late teachers and one of my mentors. His name was Joe Rose Sr. He actually just passed away a few weeks ago. And he would always perpetuate that 7th generational mentality in us ever since we were young, right? And he always did it in a way that was really, really kind, in a way that, he would say that, we're all basically just a drop. All of us combined in our actions are a drop in the river of life, right? And what he meant by that is, collectively, we all have a role in kind of pushing the ball forward, but it also isn't all on our shoulders. Like we all, as a community, as a society, need to wake up and do the part that we can, right? And so I know it sounds really daunting, right? Like to force us to think like that, but it really differs from how some people think, right? Where it's like some people are only thinking 1, 2, 3, 10 years down the road, and unfortunately a lot of people are seeing that in through the lens of profit, right? Or through the lens of capitalism, right? Where if I can just get this business, up for this many years, this is what we're going to yield, and then we'll reassess, right? When actuality, in my opinion, people should have that 7th generation mentality, because if you're starting to think that far off in all of your decision making, your decisions might be different.
Can you tell us what your work on the climate task force was like, and what recommendations you put in?
Yeah.
Made the report?
Yeah, my experience was, well, it was a bummer because they had promised me that I'd have lunch every month or so, and then we all went to virtual and there was no lunch. So that was the only disappointment that I had. But the process and the crew and the team that the lieutenant governor and governor put together was just a really awesome group of individuals from a wide array of professional backgrounds. It was really interesting to have people from some of the power industry there, right? And to see what they were working on, what they're doing. It was interesting to have both tribal and non-tribal leadership there. To have young people also voiced and present there as well. It was a really, I thought a really well-rounded group of individuals, and it was a lot of work, and it still is. It's still going to be a tremendous amount of work. We say with the unveiling of that plan, wasn't like we're done, right? It was the very beginning of this process. One was, we got to acknowledge that there's a problem. Number two was, let's start making a plan. And the third part, hardest part, is starting to implement that plan, right? And so, we met a lot over the last year, constantly, learning about, what's going on in other parts of the state, learning about, I didn't know a lot about agricultural practices and, practices that some farmers and our agricultural experts are utilizing to, reduce or help with carbon sequestration, right? So we had to learn a lot about every single field that, our communities face in Wisconsin. And so, I tried to help my best with a lot of, working with our tribal nations, because we work with 11 Ojibwe tribes, and also try to reach out to some of our other Wisconsin tribal nations, and giving our communities a strong voice and checking in with them, making sure I wasn't off base with some of the things. And some of the cool recommendations that came out of it was, the tribes really over the years have wanted more autonomy in helping to regulate wild rice and the harvest of wild rice. And so, we're hoping that stewardship committee actually comes to fruition. That was part of the recommendation, one of the recommendations. Also, a team of us worked pretty relentlessly on, developing flood mitigation plans, and, basically flood resiliency plans for communities all around the state, especially our urban or impoverished communities. And then also, what else did we do? We also spent a lot of time within every recommendation that was made, trying to figure out, like, looking at it from all angles, right? Like, does this somehow disproportionately impact, communities of color, right? Or, what are the benefits of this recommendation to, all communities? So, I really appreciated that lens right off the bat, right? That we were told, like, that has to be the lens at which we formulate a lot of these recommendations. So, we did that. There were a lot of other recommendations that didn't make it in there, that, I guess we intend to revisit, and also kind of implement and track how current recommendations are doing within the process, because we also recognize that some of those recommendations are only given teeth if they make it through the legislature or other areas that might not have as much traction. And so we might have to figure out other ways or routes to start implementing some of them. Does that make sense, or did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great. And I'm going to jump to some of the questions in the chat as well. James asks, would you discuss how sustainability practices are included in TEK? For example, is birch bark harvested in a way that does not harm a mature tree? Do indigenous practices stock walleye at a greater rate than harvested? And there are, it looks like, 2 other questions in the chat as well. People are welcome to speak up. I know it's kind of hard to jump in sometimes, but I just want to call our attention to those questions.
Yeah, a lot of TEK is rooted in sustainability. For example, we talked about berry harvesting, and this is actually something that like the Apostle Islands and some of the other management and environmental agencies are starting to get back into. But tribal communities used to do prescribed burning you know, on lands to help fertilize or to help nurture soils, to help, you know, help to grow, you know, certain species of berries and things that were utilized. And, you know, those types of, you know, age old, I don't like the word management, but like relationship practices, you know, are still used to this day. And you're right, same with the birch bark. You know, those practices are done in a way that does not harm or kill the tree. Much like when you tap a maple tree, right? There's certain things that you do um, to make sure that it's a sustainable practice, from the size of the taps that you utilize to even plugging the hole when you're done with the tree. Um, and then yes, just about all the tribes in our area right here have established fish hatcheries and have successfully run fish hatcheries. And I think even Lac du Flambeau community has had a fish hatchery well before the state of Wisconsin did, I believe. I think even the state came to Lac du Flambeau way back when to start asking advice on how to implement, because tribes recognize that, you know, this relationship that we talked about, a reciprocity, you know, needed to have balance. And so, you know, giving back and figuring out ways to, you know, continually lessen the footprint and make sure that there were fish for everybody has been a practice that's been done consistently for a long time. Also on glyphook.org website, there's information about fish hatcheries, and over the years, we've compiled lists of the approximate number of fish that are restocked into local water bodies, and it ranges in the millions.
Great. Another question from the chat is, can you speak to your tribe's hopes and dreams now that Deb Haaland is cabinet secretary?
Oh my gosh, you have no idea how many times people have asked that of me over the last few weeks. I think a lot of communities are very hopeful. It's the first time that a Native American person has ever been in charge of Native American things, as weird as that sounds, right? The Department of the Interior is what houses things like the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, you know, where tribes are given direct services and funding from the federal government for the federal trust responsibility that they have to tribes per those original treaties that were signed, right? And so it's a whole nother realm of colonization, right? When the person heading those agencies up is not part of these communities, right? And so this is like the first time that, you know, my opinion, even though it's still a colonized system, it's a form of decolonization, right? To get somebody in there minded as our communities. So, you know, I think a lot of people are optimistic that it's a good step.
Great. Another question from the chat says, can you speak more to the impacts of climate change on public health as you have already seen affecting Indigenous folks or communities in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, you know, unfortunately, we see a lot of obesity, diabetes, and, you know, a lot of heart issues, cancers, that affect our people disproportionately. And but conversely, we're seeing a lot of communities trying to revitalize our traditional practices. Oftentimes, you'll hear this mantra from a lot of our communities that culture is prevention and culture is healing. And really, what that means is that's another way to decolonize and get back to harvesting, right? Because like if you're not living a very healthy lifestyle, right? Fill it with doing some of our traditional activities, right? That trajectory puts you on a path of, one, eating well, two, constant exercise and positive work, and three, you know, learning our way of life and culture that has a lot of embedded, you know, mental health teachings and also physical and spiritual health teachings. And so we're seeing a lot of that within our communities, trying to get back to that. Also, revitalization of our language. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of important teachings within our language that are lost without knowing and understanding our language. So, you know, that's a big thing. But, you know, like I said, unfortunately, that era of colonization and the era of assimilation, has really done a lot of damage, right? That also led to, you know, today why we only have very few first language speakers of our Ojibwe language left. And so, basically we're kind of in like in a rebuilding stage, right? Trying to rebuild in a substantial way.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. I know that we're already 6 minutes past time. Are there any other questions that people have?
May I ask a question? Sorry, no, we're going over time. So, hi, Dylan. My question surrounds education. I'm currently student teaching. I'm a student at UW, and I'm student teaching a 6th grade science class. And I'm hoping to pursue a career in as a science teacher. But I'm working on creating a unit about climate change for my kids, and I was wondering how to make traditional ecological knowledge a foundational part of my unit, and not just like an additive, superficial, like, oh, this is here like a perspective on like sustainability or activism, but as like a foundational part of both the science and the piece of being inspired to make change in behavior.
Yeah, I think with our communities up here, we've seen a lot of that, and part of that is decolonizing how we think of education, right? Education kind of stereotypically gets you thinking of a classroom with tests and textbooks, right? When our original education systems were outside, right? And part of learning meant that you knew about all these environmental practices and things that we're doing to sustain our lifeway. So, really, if you want to get to the root of that, this is just my opinion, take those kids outside. They should be tapping trees, they should be learning about, and there's ways to make that as the foundation by utilizing those outdoor learning spaces, and then incorporating things into that curriculum. For instance, when we take youth out and they're tapping trees, that also gives us the opportunity to talk about everything from the barometric pressure to the weather systems to the pressure within the tree and how that works, to math areas that cover ratios, the 40-to-1 ratio, and how much sap you're going to boil down, and then how much syrup you're going to get out of that, or how much sugar you're going to get out of that, to chemistry, when you're talking about boiling the actual sap and the specific heat and the conditions that are required for those chemical changes to occur. So, I think that basically, those activities have all the content that you would need. It's just to figure out how you apply those STEM or those academic framework to the existing framework. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, I don't mean to berate you with another question. Do you have any advice in a COVID setting where we are, trying to teach through screens and those opportunities aren't necessarily as accessible, just like for the current? Hopefully that won't last forever.
Yeah, obviously a lot of stuff has to be done virtually. So like videos and things like that probably help. Some schools have been bringing in a lot of guest speakers to, like, especially tribal members, to talk about their experiences with certain harvesting practices, and also share some of that traditional knowledge. And some communities though are allowing outdoor stuff to happen, because outdoors, a little bit safer than indoor learning, right? So there's always those inlets. I don't know if that helps the most, but I know COVID has just been tough on everybody alike.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, meet which.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I would love to continue the conversation, but I think we'll probably have to do that offline just to be respectful of Dylan's time and everyone else's time. Please feel free to get in touch with us if you would like any other information. You can contact us through our website. I will also just quickly put my email in the chat, and if anyone wants to email me directly, they're welcome to do so. I also just want to acknowledge and thank, we have Kirsten Shedd who joined us tonight, who is also part of the task force in the same subcommittee as Dylan, and I want to thank her for her advocacy and for her work in that as well. So, but everybody else everyone have a great night.
Meet which, everybody. Thank you.